Bonjour.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us here. Erik and I are delighted to be here. It's the third year that we've come to this festival with a specific positioning. We are a global communications group, a bit atypical, but given our reality, our customers, and our geographical footprint, we can provide an enlightened opinion to the debate. My name is Bruno Tallent. I'm the president of the group in France. And let me say a few words about McCann. We're mostly known for what we do for our customers, our brands. We're known for working with big global brands and also local brands in their communication program. We're known for What Else, for George Clooney and Nespresso, for L'Oréal and the Olympique de Marseille publicity. But alongside that business and to feed that business, we also have innovation centers in countries, big countries like France. That's part of the network. And these countries where we look to detect trends, upcoming trends. So we carry out studies, some recurring studies, some ad hoc studies. And the study we're going to present is an ad hoc one that we organized. Hello, Erik, Bertin, and I work with Bruno on all of the topics of the agency. I'm the general manager in charge of strategy. And so I'm really in touch with these studies, and I'm a researcher also at Sciences Po, and that facilitates links with the academic world. The ad hoc study that we're going to present, we call it The Truth About the New Europe, and we'll present it in two main sections, and then we'll have some discussion time with you. Firstly, we're going to cover the 9 main observations that we were able to make based on the study, and then Erik will present the interpretation that we made of the study for the brands, which is really our field of interest. So this study talks about something that we all experience and that everyone's been talking about, especially since yesterday. That's the fragmentation of the continent that we're living on, with a context where we're seeing more and more separatists, people who are unhappy, afraid for the future. We're seeing the creation of new identity politics in the region and in the countries. And these are things that we're also seeing through our customers' experience. But from a paradoxical point of view, we're also seeing a Europe that is increasingly forward-facing, a Europe that's constantly innovating, a Europe that legislates. Our GPD comes from a Europe. It's impacted us in our profession, especially all the digital, all the CRM, database management. It's a Europe that works a lot on the evolution of its structures, thinking about way to manage exchanges. And so in this context, in this paradoxical Europe that is developing, the economic players are real stakeholders and have a role to play. And we're shedding light on a figure that comes from a recurring study that we do in the group. We have a study, Truth About Global Grounds, in a study on Europe and the rest of the world, and we see this figure coming back. 77% of people believe that international brands are better positioned than their own governments to create positive change on society and on their lives. So this is quite a high number, and it's stayed high for some time. And in view of this figure, which is roughly the same in Europe, we asked ourselves about the role that brands can play in this new Europe that's being created around us. And that's why we launched this study a few months ago. I'd just like to talk about the scope of this study. It was quantitative and qualitative, a standard methodology we use with Truth Central. There are samples of 15 to 20,000 interviews with the qualitative and quantitative aspects that are taken into account. And what's interesting is that it allows us to have a global understanding of a phenomenon, and then also regional or local breakouts. So we have data for France, England, on each of these types of studies. On the Truth About New Europe, in addition to the standard interview format, we also interviewed experts. Some 60 experts were interviewed in each country, in 15 countries, 15 to 20 countries, including France, 60 experts who were interviewed, including the two of us as experts. I say very modestly. So experts were interviewed. So this means that we've generated robust studies, not just statistical, on these big topics. This is very important. One study can contradict another. We all know that. So we have a statistic base that's very robust. So let's look at the first part now. And I'm going to look at the main observations that are derived from the study and that are food for thought, things that are interesting to look at the role of brands in this new environment. So to summarize the 9 points, I'll start with the first one, which is an observation on the importance of security, the feeling that we're being watched, but also the feeling that we need surveillance. We see this in Europe. So 83% of Europeans, it's quite a high number, 83% of Europeans think that the complete data protection should be a right, a personal right, and 71% of Europeans are trying to make their online presence difficult to track. These figures are essentially due to the threats that people are feeling in Europe. It creates mistrust, terrorism, war, climate change, all different types of threats. But it's clear that these threats generate this need for a feeling of security in Europe. And to go even further on this observation, 1/3 of Europeans say that they would support companies that would educate them on how to protect themselves and how to understand different security measures that are available. So we see a feeling, a real need for security that's being expressed at different levels. The second observation, and I think this will really be telling for you in this room, this new Europe is increasingly connected at two levels. Firstly, in terms of the geography, the territory. 89% of Europeans think that in the future Europe will be even more connected than it is today. And you're part of the EasyJet generation that we talk about in the agency. Our generation created the Europe of capitals because we had access mostly to the capitals of the European countries. And the EasyJet generation has access to European regions. It's the Europe of regions. People will go to Biarritz, Toulouse, Bristol, Malaga, Venice. And our generation tended to go to the capitals. So in addition to the geographical link, there is a link through the brands. And here's another interesting figure. 72% of Europeans believe that brands and companies should play a bigger role than they're doing now to bring together Europeans, not just through their own fields or jobs, but also through their way of being and the way that they do their jobs. Third observation concerns a new feeling of belonging that is developing, with the idea that more and more Europeans think that we should be able to choose our own nationality or identity. 55% of Europeans, that's quite an interesting figure, that nationality should be a question of choice and not of birth. So we're seeing that the internet has really accelerated this feeling. People feel more loyal to communities than they do to nations. Internet social platforms have created new connections, new links that are no longer based only on geographic proximity, but on proximity in terms of tastes, conditions, points of view. And today we are talking increasingly about e-identity, e-residence, e-nationality. The fourth point, the notion of our heritage. And if we look at this through the lens of global change, we're seeing the heritage of Europe and Europeans' culture, Europe's culture. Culture is a real marker for Europeans. 43% of Europeans believe that Europe is above all a culture. We asked people to say what they felt Europe represented, and 43% said it represented a culture that is expressed in different ways. And the second figure is important. So 43% believe it's a culture, and 53% of Europeans mention the monuments and historical sites in their region as their biggest cultural pride. And we live on a continent that thrives because of our cultural economy. We have the Eurozone, but there are also the other regions of the world who appreciate this culture, and the brands themselves, in their ways of acting, in their ways of communicating, can support or encourage local culture, and those that do so are better perceived by the Europeans. Fifth observation, things that connect us, that in our cultural base is diversity. 80% of Europeans believe that cultural diversity is Europe's greatest strength or wealth, and as such, it should be celebrated by Europeans. So we talk about this with beer, the brewing, the mixing is a wealth. So Europeans consider that this diversity, this brewing, is a real positive aspect. This cultural mixing also generates creativity. 71% of Europeans see globalization as a means to stimulate creativity. And as a result, Europeans are expecting that brands focus and give value to cultural diversity and to use it as an inspiration for innovation. When we ask the question to Europeans, when we ask them to define, in your mind, which country is the most trend-setting country, the most symbolic of new European creativity, you might be surprised, but most of the countries mention Germany, probably in association with the previous point. The sixth observation, the human dimension, the dimension of solidarity, is very important. And we're seeing in the study that people want more of benevolence and empathy in Europe. And in most countries, 74% of Europeans believe that their job contributes or their work contributes to collective well-being, and 78% believe that countries should pay individuals enough money to cover their basic needs. This means that Europeans believe, and they feel strongly about this, they feel that their professional activity has a caring dimension to it, that they have a benevolent or positive attitude to society, and that they're positive for their ecosystem. And as such, no robot could replace them in the work that they do. So it's quite an interesting aspect. And we'll see that people are really focusing on solidarity and human connection. Point 7, another feeling that we're seeing develop is the need for more solidarity, more collaboration, which could be elements that could help us to define the renewal of the European dream, with 73% of Europeans thinking that we should be sharing more and owning less. So they really appreciate values like the community being more important than the individual, quality of life more important than wealth, and universal and human rights being more important than property rights. And this is not limited to a younger generation like yours, but it's true through all of the target audiences. And similarly, Europeans express the new European dream through the expectation of an increasingly collaborative economy. 79% of Europeans believe that companies should work more together to find collaborative solutions, cooperate amongst themselves, and cooperate with all of the stakeholders in the society that they're living and working in. We have some examples, and they're not all European, but some work better in Europe than they work elsewhere. For instance, Airbnb or couch surfing, that came from an observation, a trip made by an American in Iceland, BlaBlaCar and Hitch, that are startups, one older than the other, that are based in France. The 8th observation concerns well-being associated with technology, and we're seeing that there's a general desire, a general aspiration in Europe to go through a digital detox. That's an interesting figure, especially for the younger members of the audience. 42% of Europeans would prefer to use less technology in their lives in future. So we're seeing a movement towards digital detox, to pull back partially or totally from certain platforms, social platforms, or from connections, or the number of connections during a day or a year, to come back to more direct human contact and returning to a level of spirituality and calm. Why we're seeing well-being and yoga, healthy eating, all of these things becoming more important. A last observation on sustainability. Concerning the will to create, to build a sustainable Europe with the circular economy as an ideal. Public opinion in Europe, and this is very clear in the study, puts economic players in front of their responsibilities as ecological players. So economy and ecology go hand in hand. In the past, it was antinomic, and it benefited some actors to be either one or the other. Today, there's no more choice. Economy and ecology go hand in hand, and European public opinion that is emerging, and we see this in the background of the study, they're putting economic players directly in front of their responsibility as ecological players. So circularity is becoming a new economic mode, the way that people consume and the way that Europeans assess what they buy. And so to conclude on these observations, sustainability is no longer an option. It's mandatory when you look at the figure. 96% of Europeans believe that companies should be dragged in front of the courts, and if you need be, to protect nature. Europeans are expecting brands to have values that go beyond their brand and product, that have values that include responsibility, sustainability. So Europeans are saying they are expecting brands to be honest and sincere. So we're seeing different types of expectations that come out of this. We'll go into the details. These are quite wide-ranging expectations. And then what's interesting to see is how the economic players, brands, companies, can be legitimate to respond. So we talked about data protection. We talked about connection, sharing, cohesion, the environment. These are things that people have been considering important for some time now. The human factor that we'll come back to. It's much more specific than it was in the past, and the relationship between the micro-local levels and the regional and global levels. So in this context, what seemed interesting to us was to question the position of brands and economic players in this new landscape, knowing that there is growing pressure on economic players to either respect or comply with standards or to take initiative on certain topics. So what seems to be appearing is a type of gray zone between the political and economic fields, where the brands could have a field of action. The political sphere is being challenged in terms of its legitimacy, its ways of working, and the standard economic field and even the intermediary bodies are being challenged.
And between the two, there's room. There's room for a new kind of action, something that's going to be carried out by the brands or allowed by the brands. How can I put it? There's a new dimension that the brands have picked up on, and companies generally. They have a very important role to play. They can become mediators. Brands and companies can pick up the technological infrastructure and use that infrastructure. Digital enablement, that's what we call it. It's, so that everybody benefits from that infrastructure. So with brands, economic business players, it takes on an awful lot of power. And now what's interesting for us here is that up until now, or for many years, brands have been fairly static. They created economic and commercial value using a symbolic territory. You are familiar with brands. They all grab some kind of value territory, something that makes them appear good and beautiful. And so they've appeared in a very controlled kind of framework. An advert is a whole universe. It's completely controlled by brands and businesses. So brands are beings that are static. So the radical change introduced by the digitalization of existence has driven brands to be more interactive, really interactive, not just pretending to be interactive, because for many years, brands pretended to interact. You know, when you saw a consumer in an advert, for example, it was just pretend, basically. So digitalization has forced brands to come out of their little boxes, their closed-off areas, and to be part of real life. But it's also enabled something else through technical infrastructures, through platforms. And now brands have a kind of a plastic characteristic. They can change progressively. Brands can become more organic beings. So a bit like molecules, they can have inputs and outputs, and they can initiate things that they don't necessarily then control. So it's this plasticity, if you like, this kind of grey area, this shady area, that is generating and leading to different collective individual actions. We've identified two that appear fairly interesting to study, as Bruno was saying. First of all, there's this expectation, an expectation in relation to brands and companies. We want them to attenuate some of the tensions running through our society. There are many initiatives introduced by brands trying to attain recognition for minorities, work on gender diversity or any kind of diversity. There are an awful lot of initiatives out there. And this meets an expectation for empathy. This was one of the main conclusions, in fact, of the study, Truth About Global Brands, that McCann carried out across the world. That's one of the major expectations for any kind of public. You know, how can the brand reduce the empathy gap, the lack of empathy, in other words, that we have in our society? Our society, which is riddled with tension and different centrifugal forces and different inequalities. So that's the first point, trying to repair what needs to be repaired. And the second point is, well, how can brands, how can businesses make us move from a model based on competition, very antagonistic, to a model based on cooperation and collaboration? And increasingly, what we're seeing, and this is reflected in the different movements that we're all seeing today. It reflects the idea of how can we provide an answer, a solution to a society whose business model recommends a fight without mercy, which is going to recompense the strongest, reward the strongest. So we're talking about businesses, brands, companies, but also consumers. It's about making a switch or counterbalancing this antagonistic logic, this pure head-on competition in order to create value, replacing it with a model that's based more on cooperation and collaboration, but a model that also creates value. Because at the end of the day, what we want is an alternative model. So, concerning this first topic, let me just give you a figure. 73% of Europeans are expecting brands and companies to bring together Europeans around the threat of uncertainty. There's really this expectation. It's a very strong expectation. It's something that is reflected in different ways. Inclusion has become a word that's very much bandied about. There are many companies, very many brands that are undertaking initiatives in order to demonstrate that empathy can help to reduce inequalities, can help with recognizing difference and boost people's confidence, especially minorities. So this is the initiative. This is the Dove initiative, for example, carried out by Dove. So it's something that is also reflected in new communities and their actions with new types of belonging, not just the nation-state belonging. The study shows a very interesting figure. Almost 50% of Europeans, so it's even higher in France, in fact, consider that the nation-state model is not as popular as it was, especially young people. This sovereign state model is losing speed. And very often, the communities that we have, thanks to digital technologies that are not necessarily durable, that may be one-off kind of communities, that they are, they can be temporary communities, focusing on specific subjects, but the level of investment is often inversely proportional to the durability of the movement itself. So we've got new opinion dynamics across Europe, and many people feel that they belong more to this kind of nationality that doesn't really belong to any specific country. It's kind of a cross-border nationality. So people want to be involved in very concrete actions, and brands, companies can help with that because they provide the means, they provide the infrastructure for this. There's another initiative, Patagonia initiative, the GoHat project. It was a huge petition that was launched to save European rivers and the ecosystems of certain European countries that are being very much deteriorated. And there were 150,000 signatures that were taken to the World Bank to help with reconstruction and development in order to put pressure on the bank. So Patagonia is not, well, it's not Patagonia that's acting itself. Patagonia provides basically a structure. It hosts the structure. And that's important. It's important to differentiate. Political questioning for brands and companies, it's not about replacing political legitimacy or institutional legitimacy. It's about seeing how far they can act in these grey, shady areas. Very often they have the tools that are very high-performing to be able to do this. Patagonia simply provided a structure, a hosting framework, able to centralize and facilitate and amplify this kind of action. And people found themselves, well, not as a nationality, as belonging to a nationality, but as a member of a community. So this sense of belonging to a digital community is not as strong. In fact, quite a high level of populations. Well, I'll come back to that question of community and the feeling of belonging to communities thanks to digital technologies. It's a bit complicated. Anyway, so we've got the sense of belonging. So I've got 5 minutes, only 5 minutes to go. I see. Can I take 10 minutes? Okay, we'll try and speed things up. So there's the one nation that is based in Marseille. It's based on the idea that people are misunderstood. These people in Marseille are combatants, but they can be anywhere in the world. So these initiatives are fairly complicated to manage. You can move from an opportunity to opportunism, for example. Greenwashing is a theme that is threatening many companies today. We're seeing it every day. Just a little example. HSBC tried to focus on Brexit and use it to its best advantage, and there was a lot of backlash because of that. Now, the question raised, it's very simple, this question. What we're seeing is that there's a switch from communication to action. This seems very simplistic, put like that. But in reality, the problem is how can you be sincere when you're a company or a brand and you're supporting actions? How can you facilitate what consumers are doing by putting them inside an initiative, including them in an initiative without appearing to be too opportunistic, without appearing to want to develop your image? Okay, let me go very quickly on to the second point then. So, we were talking about moving from a competitive model to a collaborative or cooperative model. Both models work together, of course. So, what about collaboration between companies? There's the B Corp community that was founded in 2006 in the United States. The idea was to bring together as many companies as possible for whom the societal mission was a global performance indicator for the company. So this movement is developing a lot. There are 60 companies in France that are part of the movement. So it's all about creating an alliance. That's what the logic is. And what's very important in this part, I believe, is that today nobody can do things alone. Nobody can be successful alone, whether we're talking about individual consumers or brands or celebrities. It's all about alliance today, partnerships. So this notion of collaborating has become, it's kind of bandied about as well. All brands, all companies are involved in collaborating. In fact, so in this fragmented world where everybody has a voice, this idea of alliance has become a driving force. So Bruno said this earlier on. So consumers want to share more and possess less. This is what they're saying. There are many initiatives that are trying to recreate economic, social, and political value by moving away from the conventional growth model. So, there's the circular economy. We've already mentioned that, for example. An economy based on participation. You will have seen that many stakeholders, many companies, businesses refuse to subscribe to the notion of Black Friday, like that Belgian brand, Belrose, that transformed it into Blue Friday. They didn't do any promotions. And the gap in sales, the difference in sales, they invested into saving oceans. So that's a very good illustration. So it's all about getting rid of intermediation, and that's a fundamental question when it comes to changing this agonistic model, getting rid of intermediation, creating value thanks to sharing between people. Okay, I'll move through these different initiatives fairly quickly. In fact, I'll jump them. Now, another source of collaboration where companies and brands are doing something focuses on reducing the digital divide, but also reducing the financial divide. In other words, facilitating education in digital technology and buying into financial management tools, helping people to buy into those tools, people who don't necessarily have the material or intellectual means of doing so otherwise. Anyway, I don't have time to go into that in details. But in Poland, there was a whole program called Business Facelift. It was initiated by MasterCard, working with NGOs specialized in urban design. The idea was to help small businesses that were disappearing, giving them tools to help with their shop signs, to help them improve their business models as well. you'll be able to have a look at the presentation later on. I think it will be available. So that's another emblematic initiative by Quant, a French research engine promoting a safer internet with no individual traceability. I'll try and conclude because I think we've run out of time. In fact, the challenge ahead, because we've already described the lovely side of the coin, the evolution of the model, the cultural, economic and social model has changed. But there's still a lot to be done, and we can't forget that all brands and companies want to create value. That's their business model. They want recognition. So there's a first challenge, a first equation. So we've got to find a balance between credibility and visibility, because very often these initiatives that we're seeing, they start in the field. They're not very visible. They're grassroots, but then very soon businesses need to have them recognized. In fact, there's a kind of contradiction between the visibility threshold and the confidence threshold. In other words, the more visible the initiative, the more the more mistrust or distrust might be created. So this is the first paradox, if you like. Communicating tends to undermine the initiative. In other words, it tends to shed guilt on it. So that's the first thing that's very complex. It's quite complicated to understand. The second thing is linked to that first thing. These initiatives, we're not talking about campaigns anymore. A campaign is too much linked to advertising. A campaign is about managing problems, using images, using pictures. An initiative is a group of individuals focusing on a project in order to achieve objectives. So we're talking more about initiatives today. And these initiatives often start in some kind of fabric, a citizen fabric or an individual fabric, so something small scale. Now, what happens is when these initiatives get big, they're much more visible. They're victims of their success. So how do you then make sure that they are seen as ethical as they were to begin with? How do you get them to slowly change from something that's micro and local or regional to something that's more global? And this is something that Patagonia does very well, one of my favorite brands.
I
think we can conclude, maybe not with an initiative, but with a campaign. And in fact, I don't know whether you saw the last campaign by Opel. Opel with PSA has a new life. And if you've seen it in France, it's a European campaign. It's a campaign created by Europeans. So that's interesting already. 4 creatives from 4 major Europeans working together with different countries to design a platform which initially was born in Germany but was made for Europeans, or born in Germany, made for us all. That was the advertising message. So the message is that it's for a European population, a European public, and it uses sounds that are linked to Europe. So this is the English version. No sound, unfortunately.
Thank you, Europe, for your countless shortcuts, for your darkest days, for your bumpy roads. for every tiny parking spot. You make us engineer great cars for everyone. Opel, born in Germany, made for us all. Discover now the Opel 120 years models with attractive option packs.
So let's finish with that little video. You will have recognized the European hymn sung by somebody playing on the piano. Thank you very much. I think it's time for questions now.
Vous avez mentionné.
So you said the wish to emphasize diversity. Do you know when this wish started to appear, and how did it impact the societies at that time? Well, the most emblematic initiative, the oldest initiative, is the Dove initiative, with its campaign. Dates back 15 years now, I believe. So it showed bodies of women, and it focused on the equality of beauty. It was much before the emergence and of the theme of inclusion and diversity and recognition of minorities. So they were very much ahead of their time, Dove, with this advert. Now, of course, there have been other adverts since then. In Asia, I think it started. It was a campaign for Asia. And after that, it was so successful, it was so new, that it was rolled out into other Dove countries. Unilever took it over. And it became a kind of the base, if you like, of the strategic platform for the Dove brand. And it had a huge impact on the sector. But in terms of brands, I'd say it was Dove 15 years ago that started everything off. I'm sorry, the gentleman needs to use a microphone, otherwise we cannot hear in the interpreting booth. Sorry. So you based your first part on statistics with many interviews that you referred to. Do you know what the pyramid or panel of ages of people interviewed is, and their professional or social categories that they belong to? No, we don't have the split, sorry, or the breakdown. But we're looking at a population between the ages of 18 and 65, but we don't have the results according to age group. But it would be interesting to look at that, yes. Do you really think that brands today have the same impact that they had 10, 15, 20 years ago? I don't know whether this is just my own opinion, but I don't see adverts anymore. I only use Netflix. I listen to music using Spotify. So I don't have the same vision as brands, or the vision that you might have had of brands. MasterCard, Dove, we're talking about 20 years ago. So I wanted to know whether you really think that brands still have the same impact as they did in the past. Yes, that's a very important question. Yes, they are in a difficult situation because of the society and how horizontal it is today. Everybody is producing, writing, influencing, producing content. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, everybody is suspecting everybody else. There's the tyranny of transparency. So all actions need to be filtered all the time. And then you've got the model of communication that is changing. In other words, individuals they're looking at screens, different screens at the same time, and they are exposed to brands in very different ways, changing ways. And so the communication model has changed very much. There are fewer big TV campaigns because to reach out to different types of public, it's not the best kind of medium to use. And they're fighting through their actions. They are introducing a lot of initiatives via social media. They use digital technologies. But I think the most important thing is that, well, instead of imposing a message, they're encouraging things to emerge. They're much more relevant and efficient when they help a message to emerge. So when they are aggregating rather than dictating a stance, a position. Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. I might disappoint you, but I think they're still there, brands. They're still within your sphere of action and behavior, but they're there differently. They're changing. They've changed. They've mutated. They've adapted to new generations. They've adapted to new consumer modes. You talked about Netflix. If that's not a brand, I don't know what a brand is anymore. So, yes, you've been had, basically. So you talking about old brands, but no, Netflix is a brand too. It's a new brand. Perhaps in 5 years' time, the people here will say, well, you've got old brands like Netflix, and then they will cite other brands that are newer. Perhaps the old brands that you're talking about, perhaps you are seeing them in Netflix series because they have products in those series, or because they've generated content that is being displayed via Netflix through a series that you think is brilliant, but in fact, it's being co-financed by a brand. So there's a whole ecosystem out there that is changing. But at the end of the day, everything you're seeing, everything that we're seeing, well, we believe in that profession, and all of the studies that we do at European and world level are showing that brands, and especially global brands, they're continuing to be seen in an increasingly complex world. They've got their landmarks, and more they're in line with what a brand means. A brand means a landmark, basically. That's what a brand is. So you're right, but at the same time, things are changing. Things are changing, and they do have a future ahead of them, do brands. Do you think that the need to protect data can be reconciled with the need of brands to pick up information in order to focus on a specific population? We are not legislators. And, well, what can we say? I think increasingly we are living in a world, and I don't want to draw a terrible simile, a world where everything is at the same time. Brands at the same time have to do different actions because the expectations of the general public are increasingly targeted and precise or even individualized. So they need to understand their target public. But at the same time, people don't want to be disturbed. They don't want to be disturbed in what they're doing. So I'd like to say yes, it does add a kind of a supervision that you might say is a constraint or a requirement, or you can also refer to that as a best practice. I think it also depends on the quality of the way data is used by brands. And the major difficulty today is that brands, and I'm talking about brands in the broad sense of the term, because Google is also a brand, Netflix is a brand. All brands are trying to pick up data. But very few regardless of the legal problems, that very few are able to transform that data into value propositions for consumers, for individuals. So I think it's all about contracts. It's a logic based on contracts. If a brand can create a contract, can set up a contract that offers value, you know, if you give me that data, this is what I will give in exchange for that data. And when I say in exchange, it means not just some kind of sales proposal. You know, you can click there and have access to a newsletter and then be reoriented towards, I don't know, Amazon and buy a book. That's it. That's picking up data without transforming that data into value. When brands are able to do that, when they can fulfill this new contract, that there will be a social impact. There will be a digital social impact. But there is also a political dimension. There's the ultimate risk of finding that things are ultra customized through personal data. This means that there will be greater fragmentation of individuals. There will be an exponential fragmentation of individuals. There are many studies about how data can be governed. There's a philosopher called Rouvois who has demonstrated the political risks of this fantasy that is focusing on optimizing data. Okay, I think we'll put an end to the conference now because we've already gone over time. Oh, we can thank Mr. Tallent and Mr. Bertin.